video of what happened in court, and the official record is always the transcript. So I don't feel comfortable sitting back and agreeing to that because I feel like that's an issue. Another issue is...
Well, I feel comfortable with it.
Okay. The other issue is, again, say we want to renew its objection to this coming in because this violates their own motion in limine. Their motion in limine was that there would be no reference to this defendant invoking his right to an attorney. And previously, the day before this advisory hearing, when he was at the Manatee County Sheriff's Office, he asked for an attorney. He was clear, calm, and coherent when he asked for that attorney. Pursuant to case law, we redacted that and did not show that to the jury. And now here they are basically putting in the same evidence the next day when it suits them and when it shows that he is saying some things that appear to be bizarre. In this transcript and in the video, Judge Andrews asked him, would you like me to hire or appoint an attorney to represent you? He says no. And then they go on to have that discussion where he says he wants an attorney who's pure and good, or he wants God to represent him because those statements favor their side. But when it's not favorable to them, when he's at the Manatee County Sheriff's Office, they had us redacted. So that seems fundamentally unfair to us.
Well, they raised the point that there are two different issues, and I agree. I think it's a difference between I want you to appoint a lawyer, I do not want you to appoint a lawyer, and I want to go ahead and speak to you now. I don't think that's the same issue. Okay, so are we ready to go?
Judge, I think we're prepared on Castle.
Yeah.
Judge, at this point, I don't think there's anything we can do other than ask that you set him free and replace him with the alternate.
Is that what you want?
Well, I think, yes, that's what we're asking.
Okay, can I see that case, please? And you don't want that?
Just,
we don't care.
I don't think it's necessary, but if I'm not
Do you
sure.
want me to just do it?
I'm not sure.
And not make it an issue?
It's
So
probably.
I don't have to read
Yeah.
this? Okay.
If they're going to find it, I think.
All right.
It's an issue.
Okay, so that means Ms. Urizari, I think, right, Megan, comes up and sits in the first spot. Okay. So let's bring Mr. Castle in, please.
Jocelyn, Deputy Bryce. You bring in your Castle, just Castle. Be seated with them.
Good morning.
Good morning, how are you?
Fantastic.
Well,
You can just remain standing.
huh?
I said fantastic.
Okay. You got to be released, and I want to tell you why, because of the address problem.
Okay.
When you were back there for our individual sequestered voir dire, I heard you say you lived in Trinity, and I thought, ooh, maybe that's part. Now, it turns out it's not.
It's Pasco.
Right. And it also turns out that you changed your driver's license in early to mid-December, I think, to reflect your correct address.
Yes.
So
When I moved, I changed right after I moved.
how did you get your summons?
In the mail.
With your Trinity address?
Yes. I brought it in too, and I showed the lady at the jury assembly room.
And
I said I thought I should go to Pasco, and she's like, "No, you're here. This is right number."
okay. It probably would not be an issue, but if Mr. Jonchuck is convicted, that could be an appellate issue. I don't think it'd be something huge, but we try as hard as we can not to just make appellate issues, if that makes sense to you.
Understood.
You've been a very attentive, you've been a great juror. I've watched you take notes. I think you're a fabulous juror. But as opposed to invite a problem that we know about, I have to let you go.
No, I understand.
Okay? And Ms. Urizari is going to take your place. And you can now read about Yeah. So, do you have anything back in the jury room?
Just a lunchbox and some water.
Could you get it? The lunchbox and the water?
Is your hat back there too?
No, I didn't bring it.
You didn't bring out cover today? Okay.
Thanks, sir.
And I'm serious, he'll,
Yeah.
yeah, the
You want me
deputy,
to go out that way, or?
well, go out the back and you'll go in the jury room and get the,
Just wait in the hallway, he'll get what you need, and then you can take it down the stairwell.
Yep.
All right.
I wish I could give you a gift card or something like
Oh,
that.
no, no worries.
Okay,
Thank you.
And
Oh,
Jay,
yeah.
yes,
I don't know if he wants to go down and talk to jury services. As far as my understanding, it seems like it might have been a DMV issue when he changed his address, that they didn't code it properly county-wise. So he might just want to go downstairs and verify with jury, and then he might have to go to the DMV, and so it doesn't happen in the future.
for me, I wouldn't worry about it,
Yeah.
but it's up to you.
Okay, thank
Okay,
you.
you're welcome.
Thank you.
Okay, are we ready? And then I'll tell Miss Irizarry she's in number one.
It's a good opportunity, folks, check your cell phones, electronic devices, make sure they are off and put away.
Does anybody want me to comment on his absence? I think it's very strange, and people wonder. I think it's better off if they know, but I'll do what everybody wants me to do.
You should tell us.
Yeah,
Yeah, no objection to.
Okay. all right.
You can tell him he moved to Pasco after he got his notice and he,
I'll be able to figure it out.
So everybody's shifting. Supervisor is coming up here. Or you want to just leave them lined up the way they are and leave an empty chair?
Yeah, she's gonna be in chair number one, yeah. But everybody doesn't have to shift, because he's gone and she's there.
Right. I'm just
Okay.
saying we got an empty chair. Maybe she's,
Yeah, those people, yes, could move up, yes,
so.
yeah.
She's 13, right? Do you want to leave that one in space or bring them down?
Bring him down, please.
Maybe she can see.
Right.
This one, she was number 13. I don't know how they're shifted.
I got hers 12. Wait a minute, hold on.
I got a sheet, hold on.
Yeah, I got her as 12. Because that would be 13, 14, 15.
Yeah, she's you got her 13. That's,
She was 13.
oh, so she'd be in that chair there. No, no, she'll stay there. We just shift her chair. When you're ready, bring him in.
Yeah, yes, please.
Jocelyn, Deputy Rice. Line him up, bring him in. No, no. fire drill, you know? Get out, run around, and shake things up a bit. Yep. And the back row is just shifting the chair.
Yep.
All right. Number one question, all cell phones and devices are off, right? Number two, those are your notepads, correct?
Yes.
Very good. Jury's in the jury box and seat, John.
Thank you. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I want to explain to you why Mr. Castle's not here. It's through no fault of his own. He lives in Pasco County. And the screw-up is from the clerk's office, he got a subpoena at his Trinity address. Nobody knows how that happened. On the jury list for an address, he's at his old address, Palm Harbor. So how any of that happened, no one knows. But there's an issue about whether somebody that doesn't live in Pinellas County should be sitting on the jury. So that's why, okay?
Okay.
All right. Anybody have anything I need to know? No? Okay. You may call your next witness.
The defense calls Paige Parrish.
Stand right here. Face to the clerk, raise your right hand, prepare to take the oath.
Did you solemnly
Please
swear?
remember the bar. Doesn't have to give you sworn.
There it is. But you do have to have a seat in that little chair, speaking loud and clear voice for the court, move up close to the mic.
May I proceed? Could you please state your full name?
Paige Parrish, P-A-R-I-S-H is the last name.
And what is your occupation?
I am a licensed attorney in the state of Florida,
And who do you work for?
the public defender for the 6th Judicial Circuit.
How long have you worked there?
It'll be 10 years in June.
Are you familiar with what a first appearance or advisory hearing is?
I am. In the state of Florida, the Florida Rules of Criminal Procedure provide that when somebody is arrested, they are to be brought before a judge within 24 hours of their arrest.
And is part of your duty at the public defender's office to, at times, be the lawyer present at the advisory hearing?
Yes, so our office does a rotation. People are advised for misdemeanors at 8:30 in the morning, for domestic batteries at 10 a.m. in the morning, and for felonies at 1:30 in the afternoon. And so our office rotates, and we always have an attorney present at each of those hearings, so that there is an attorney present in the room. There's also a prosecutor and a judge that's there.
And are you physically present in the same room as where the defendant who is being advised is?
No, so there's a courtroom in this building, and that's where myself or another member of the public defender's office, plus a prosecutor and a judge are. And then over at the jail, there's 2 places where the inmates are held for those hearings. There's one in Central, and then there's one in the healthcare division. So if folks need additional physical or mental health care, they are at the healthcare division over at the jail, and there's a room there where they're brought in front of a camera. They can see the judge, we can see them, and so everything is video conferenced.
Were you present at the advisory hearing for Mr. Jonchuck in January of 2015?
I was.
Right. Have you had a chance to review a video recording of that hearing?
I have.
May I approach the clerk and the witness counter? I'm showing you what's been pre-marked for identification as Defense Exhibit 15. Do you recognize this?
I do.
How do you recognize it?
I have my initials on the disc.
And is this a fair and accurate depiction of what happened at the advisory hearing in January of 2015?
It is.
Your Honor, I asked to introduce what's previously been marked as Defense Exhibit 15 into evidence as Defense 15.
Okay, it'll be received over the state's objection.
And may I publish?
Yes.
Can you hear me, sir? Yeah. You are John Jonchuck? two guys not going to be representing you in this case? You're going to be standing trial. Would you like someone standing next to you as you're standing trial?
Yeah.
An attorney.
That is pure and good, not evil.
I'll do the best I can to give you a pure and good lawyer. If you raise your right hand. Can you raise his right hand?
I don't want a court-appointed lawyer. I want to leave it in the hands of God.
No further questions? Do you have any questions?
Just one.
Okay.
Just very quickly, Ms. Parrish, do you work for the same law firm that represents the defendant today?
I do.
That's all I have.
Anything further?
No, Your Honor.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Parrish. She doesn't need to be on standby, right?
No, Your Honor.
Okay. You may call your next witness.
The defense calls Jim Jones.
And sir, if you would, stand right here for me. Case clerk, over here a little more. Well, that's fine. Case clerk, prepare to take the oath.
You do solemnly swear affirm to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God.
Yes, I do.
And now we would have a seat in the red chair, speaking loud and clear voice for the court.
Good morning, Mr. Jones.
Good morning.
Move up close to the mic.
Thank you. Good morning.
Could you please state your full name?
My name is Jim Jones.
And who do you work for?
I work for the Pinellas County Sheriff's Office.
What is your responsibility or your job with the sheriff's office?
I'm an administrative nursing supervisor. My responsibilities are to oversee our medical records department, infection control, case management, education, and training.
Are you ever asked to give testimony in court about an inmate's status, health status, that sort of thing?
Yes.
So this isn't the first time you've testified?
No, ma'am.
Okay. When a person is booked into the Pinellas County Jail, is there a health screening that is done?
Yes, there's a comprehensive health screening.
And does the sheriff's office have a policy that is to be followed with regards to the health screening?
Yes.
May I approach the clerk?
Sure.
May I approach?
Will you go, John?
you, does the Pinellas County Sheriff's Office have a policy that is to be followed for health screening when an inmate is booked into the jail?
We have standard operating procedure, yes.
And does the standard operating procedure for the health screening, well, just in general, what does that include?
In general, we're asking the individual about their current medical status, any past history of any surgeries, any chronic conditions. Do you take any medications? If so, what are they? When's the last time you took them? Do you have any injuries on you? If so, where are they? We'll document whether it be a bruise, an abrasion, whatever. Are you allergic to anything? Do you use alcohol? If so, how much, how often was the last time you used? Do you use any street drugs? What type? How often? When's the last time you used? If you stop using alcohol, street drugs, do you go through any type of withdrawal? We do a cursory mental health screening. Are you feeling suicidal, homicidal? Have you ever been Baker acted? If so, when, where? Those types of things.
Okay, so the inmate is asked about drug and alcohol use?
Yes.
Okay. Is it the standard operating procedure of the sheriff's office that an inmate who is being booked in, a male inmate who is being booked in, be tested for drugs or alcohol?
No.
Is there a difference with females?
There is a difference. Within this standard operating procedure, females that are booked in of the age 13 to 55 are given a pregnancy test, and the females who fall out of that range, who state they're pregnant, are also given a urine pregnancy test. If the pregnancy test is positive, then we will follow up with a drug test.
Okay. But not for males?
Not for males.
Okay. If a person is booked into jail and there is a, excuse me, a concern that the person may be so under the influence of something, a drug or alcohol, is there a procedure that the sheriff's office follows?
If their condition is compromised in a manner where we can't handle that level of care at the jail, or we suspect that it may further worsen the condition, then we're going to call 911 and send them off to the ER for further evaluation.
And would that same procedure be followed if the person was, in the minds of the admitting staff, perhaps be withdrawing from something that was compromising their well-being?
If it was compromising to the amount, if it compromised to the amount to where we couldn't take care of his needs, we would send them to the hospital. Err on the side of caution.
Are you familiar with who Mr. Jonchuck is?
Yes.
Okay. Have you had an opportunity to review any jail record information as it relates to whether any drug testing was done on Mr. Jonchuck when he was booked into the county jail in January of 2015?
The only information I reviewed was 2 days ago when Dr. Poorman called me to ask if...
Let's approach, please.
My question one more time, okay?
Okay.
As it relates to when Mr. Jonchuck was booked into jail in January of 2015, okay? In that time frame. Have you had the opportunity to review any of that record to know whether Mr. Jonchuck was drug tested?
I have physically not reviewed any of his records.
Do you have knowledge of whether Mr. Jonchuck was drug tested?
Well, I reviewed the subpoena specifically for the drug testing. I believe it was a 7-day span.
Yes.
let me reframe my question. Have you had an opportunity, well, do you know if Mr. Jonchuck was drug tested when he was booked into the Pinellas County Jail?
Do I know if he was?
Correct.
According to the
With,
subpoena?
hold on.
Okay.
Have you had the record reviewed so that
It has been reviewed by our medical records supervisor.
And based on that knowledge, was he drug tested when
No.
he was?
He was not drug tested.
When he was booked into the jail?
Correct.
Okay.
Sorry.
Nothing further.
Ross?
So a male under no condition gets a blood test, right?
No.
And you would send them to the ER if they were lethargic or obtunded?
If their medical condition warranted them to be transferred from the jail for further evaluation, and that was one of the symptoms, we would.
What's obtunded?
It's a decreased level of alertness, not able to arouse by tactile or verbal stimuli.
Okay. And you wouldn't even ask you send them to emergency room, you wouldn't even ask the emergency room to collect blood, would you?
No, that's at the discretion of the ER physician.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Anything further, Ms. McNeil?
No, Your Honor.
Can Mr. Jones be excused, or should he be stood by?
Oh, do you have a question?
Oh, Mr. Azaria. Your question is Mr. Jones a nurse?
I'm a registered nurse. Yes.
That answers your question, correct? Yes, ma'am. Okay, anybody else have a question for Mr. Jones? Not seeing any other hands. Okay, stand by or excuse?
Excused.
Date?
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you for your testimony,
Thank you.
Mr. Jones.
You're welcome.
Sorry, Ms. Urizari, I'll be number. Huh?
Just did it again.
Oh. I'll just touch on. Okay, you may call your next witness.
The defense calls Dr. Michael Mayer.
And sir, if you would step over here for me, please. Stand right here, face this clerk. Raise your right hand for the take the oath.
You do solemnly swear affirm to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God.
Yes, I do. And now, sir, if you would have a seat in the red chair. Thank you. Speaking loud and clear voice for the court, make sure you move up close to the mic, all right? Thank you.
Good morning, Dr. Mayer.
Good morning.
Could you please state your full name for the record?
Michael Scott Mayer, Maher, MD.
And what is your occupation?
I'm a physician and psychiatrist licensed to practice medicine in the state of Florida.
Could you describe for the jury a bit about your education and training?
Yes. I graduated from New College in Sarasota, Florida in 1975 with a bachelor's degree in molecular biology. I then attended the University of South Florida College of Medicine in Tampa and graduated in 1979 with my MD. I then began a general medical internship at Tampa General Hospital, the VA hospital, and a few other smaller facilities where I did general medicine and emergency room work for a year. I then completed 3 years of specialty training in psychiatry. During that time, I was involved in the research and training activities and served as the chief resident supervising other residents in training during my last year. Following that, I was appointed to the University of South Florida College of Medicine Psychiatry Department as an assistant professor in psychiatry on a part-time basis, and I began my private practice. I continued with various appointments with the University of South Florida on a limited basis for approximately 30 years, and I have continued in my private practice continuously since 1983. I received my board certification in psychiatry in 1985 and my board certification in forensic psychiatry in 1999. I have...
May I stop you for just
sure.
a moment? Are those certifications that you keep up to date and you still have?
Yes, there are all certifications that I keep up to date. Some of them require retesting and recertification, some of them don't. And they go along with the renewal of a medical license, which requires continuing medical education and so on. So they're integrated together in that respect.
Okay.
And I have always maintained those in good standing. Okay. My current practice involves clinical and what's known as forensic or legal practice, where I'm involved in cases that will or might become court cases. Most of my practice in terms of the patients I see and the time I spend with patients is a general outpatient psychiatry practice in my office in Tampa.
As part of your private clinical practice, do you need to stay, I guess, up to date and have knowledge of what's going on in your field of psychiatry?
I do, and those are specific legal requirements for the state of Florida. There are also ethical and professional requirements to maintain board certification, and there are, if you will, moral and ethical requirements on a personal level to stay sharp as a doctor.
So about what percentage of your practice is your clinical private practice versus the forensic work?
The time that I spend, I actually spend more time in the clinical practice. I describe it as a 50-50 practice because I earn a little more money for the amount of time I spend doing the forensic or the legal practice. But in terms of the people I see, I spend more time doing the clinical practice. In terms of the overall business of the practice, it's about 50-50.
Let's talk a little bit about the forensic practice that you have. What does that consist of?
Currently, the legal part of my practice, or the forensic practice, involves mostly evaluating people in Hillsborough and adjacent counties who are either involved in criminal matters where their competency to come to court is in question, or they're involved in what are known as dependency cases, where a child is at risk in a home and the state has intervened to evaluate the safety of the child and evaluate whether the child should stay in the home. Those are known as dependency cases, and in the last 5 years, most of my legal practice has been involved in those kinds of cases.
How do you come to be involved in the dependency type of cases?
Typically, I'm asked by a agency that is mandated by the state of Florida. So there are various private agencies, all of them nonprofits, that are mandated by the state of Florida that manage the cases. And I'll get a referral from them. Sometimes it's as a result of a court order from the dependency court judge. Sometimes it's on their own initiative. And my initial involvement is usually in evaluating the parents or the guardian. Usually that it means the parents. Sometimes it's the child who I evaluate directly.
For the competency evaluation part of your legal practice, how do you come to be involved in those types of evaluations?
Those evaluations are almost always initiated by an order from a judge, a court order, to evaluate an individual with regard to specific, almost always criminal matters. occasionally civil matters related to pending charges.
And of the portion of your practice that is a legal practice, can you give us an idea of how much is the court-appointed and referral versus being asked by a private individual, private attorney, to be involved in a case?
Yes. In the past, I tended to do a good deal of work at the request of defense attorneys in criminal cases. So a defense attorney would contact me, ask me to evaluate somebody, I'd evaluate them and provide some input. I still do that work. This case would fit into that pattern on a pretty regular basis, and probably come to court on similar cases a half a dozen times a year.
Have you been, you just mentioned you've been probably half a dozen times a year that you've been called to testify. So have you given your opinion in court at the request of either the court or other attorneys?
Yes, many times. Mostly in the last 5 years, it's been in dependency court, and probably I end up in dependency court a couple of times a month. But I still do some of this work that is related to criminal cases.
Why do you keep your practice at about 50% clinical practice, seeing patients, and about 50% doing the legal work?
There are formal, not absolutely required, but formal expectations from professional organizations that I respect and either are or have been a member of that don't mandate but make it a strong recommendation that an individual who's involved in this legal work maintain an active clinical practice so that they remain grounded as a physician rather than a court expert, if you will. There are some formal requirements here and there. Beyond that, it's my choice and belief and preference to see people and treat people as a physician and psychiatrist in my office. It has also been my experience that all of the formal training and experience is very important, but ultimately where I really continued to learn about medicine and psychiatry is from the people I see in my office who I talk to under circumstances where there's no legal case or no question about legal issues. So in some ways that's the most fulfilling part of my practice.
May we approach? Do we need to? Yes. Doctor, I'd like to start talking to you about your involvement in this particular case with Mr. Jonchuck.
Yes.
How did you become to be involved in the case?
I was contacted sometime back before July of 2017 by your office and asked if I would be available to meet with him and evaluate him, and I indicated that I would
be. And are we paying you for your involvement in the case?
You are paying me at my usual rate of $250 an hour.
Have we asked you to sit in and listen to the testimony of other experts in this case?
No.
Is it important to you for your opinion in this case that you have seen the other experts testify?
No, it's not important that I've seen them testify.
Are you familiar with, and we'll get into more specifics later, are you familiar with other opinions of experts in this case?
Yes, I am.
If it was important to your opinion in this case to hear from all of the other experts, would you ask to sit in?
I certainly would. I would make it very clear that that was an essential part of my work and request that.
Okay. If you could describe for the jury a little bit about what your process is of when you become retained on a case like this. What do you do?
Sure. The first thing is to talk to the attorney very briefly about the case and the charges, get a very brief description of what the person's charged with and what the reason that they think mental health input might be important in their case. I almost always request some information, such as the basic police reports, before I see somebody. I prefer to have some information from what I would think of as third-party sources, police reports, for example. I also prefer to look at those in great detail after I've seen the defendant, the individual who's charged. So that would be my process in this case. In a complicated case such as this, looking at and ensuring that I've had access to all of the reasonable records that are available in the case, police reports, medical reports, past family history, depositions of witnesses, police officers, doctors, reports of mental illness issues, competency reports, reports from hospital if a person's been in the hospital. All of those things I would consider especially important in a case such as this, and that would be a part of my method in this case.
Right. And did you in fact receive all of those various materials and review those?
I did, and I requested that your office provide me with everything available, and I was assured that you were not holding anything back.
Okay. You referred just a moment ago, Dr. Mayer, as this being a complicated case.
Yes.
Why do you say that?
There's long-standing mental illness which is clearly present and documented before the offense. There is a complicated family history related to John and his daughter and the mother. There is a complicated family history related to his family of origin, that is where he grew up and the circumstances of him growing up. There's a history of mental health treatment, various medications. There's a history of conflict in the family. So there are many factors which all need to be considered and make this case more complicated than most.
As part of your review in this case of all those things you just talked about, did you, in addition to reviewing all of the records, did you speak independently with any of the people involved, John's family or law enforcement or anybody?
I did not.
Why is that?
My experience and belief is that, particularly in a case such as this, where various people have various different motives and biases and interests, the information which is somewhat more formally obtained, police reports, depositions of relevant individuals that are sworn testimony under oath that they're accountable for, medical records, that those represent the highest quality information, and that my role as a physician is not to do police or criminal investigations, not to do extensive medical investigations beyond the case and the circumstances that are related to it. So while the input from family members is very important to me, I prefer to consider that input in the context of it being offered in the case rather than what they might say to me in the privacy of my office, which might be less reliable.
So reliability, is that kind of what it?
Yes.
And you mentioned, I just want to get the date out there, approximately when were you contacted to become involved in this case by my office?
I indicate that I accepted the case on May 15, 2017. So that's probably when I said to someone in your office, yes, I'm available to do this, and they say, okay, we'd like you to work on it.
Okay. so some 2 years and 5 months, if my math is right, after the date of offense?
Yes.
Contrasting that with your clinical practice, do you find it important to obtain collateral information from friends, family, in that context of your practice?
Yes, that would be a very different situation. First, because there's no police reports or depositions in those cases, and second, because it is the family members who are then living with them or dealing with them or have a relationship with them that are most influenced and significant in the patient's life. So sometimes the patient will ask me to see their husband or wife. Sometimes I will ask to see somebody. So in those circumstances, obtaining a family history, not just from the patient, but from other family members, is a part of my usual practice, and I'm comfortable and engaged in doing that.
Have you met with John?
I have.
When did you first meet with him?
I met with him July 3, 2017.
Where did you meet with him?
That was at the North Florida Treatment and Evaluation Center in Gainesville. That's an inpatient psychiatric hospital.
Approximately how long did you meet with him?
About 3 hours, 2.5 to 3 hours.
Okay. Did you find that amount of time sufficient to ask what you needed to in order to formulate your opinion in this case?
I did.
Did we put any sort of time limit on you or say we can only pay you for 3 hours or anything like that?
No.
And have you billed more than 3 hours?
I've billed a lot of hours in this case,
okay.
Many hours looking at and reviewing and considering documents and other information.
Have you had a second opportunity to meet with Mr. Jonchuck?
I have, yes.
And when was that?
That was March 13 of this year, just a few weeks ago.
And where did that take place?
That was at the Pinellas County Jail.
Why did you want to meet with John?
I had been intending to meet with him before the trial began. I was actually planning to go up to the state hospital, but for logistical reasons that didn't work out. So when he got here, I went out on a Saturday morning before the trial started to see him.
And did anything about your meeting with Mr. Jonchuck just a couple weeks ago change your opinion that you had formulated previously in this case?
No.
Okay. All right, I want to talk now about the interview that you had with Mr. Jonchuck back in July of 2017. If you could just sort of describe what your process is for when you go into an evaluation of this sort.
Yes. First and foremost, I am very careful to make sure that the person I'm talking to understands in some reasonable way who I am, what I'm doing, and why I'm there. So I introduced myself. I asked him if he had been told by his attorneys and his treatment team that a doctor would be coming to see him. He said that he was, and he was anticipating that I would be there to talk to him. I told him that this was, I would be asking him information about his background, his case, and related things, and asked him if that was okay with him. He said yes, that it was. I asked him if he was comfortable talking to me in the surroundings that we were talking in. That's a standard question I ask, and he said he was a little bit uncomfortable. We were in a closed and private area but it was glass on two sides, and there were people watching him and watching us while the conversation was going on. He said that made him nervous, and he I don't remember if he said he didn't like it, but it made him nervous. And I asked him if he was comfortable going on with it in spite of that, and he said he was. So we continued. I then asked him a lot, as is my usual practice, of what I would describe as very open-ended questions about his life, his background, his circumstances, and ultimately about the charges against him.
And we've heard from other people some of those, some of that background information. So I'm going to sort of move to, did you do any, what I'll call paper and pencil testing with Mr. Jonchuck?
I didn't do any, I think what you're referring to as paper and pencil testing, which sometimes is called psychological testing or statistical testing. I'm familiar with those sorts of tests and use them occasionally, but not in this case.
Okay. And was there a reason that you didn't?
Yes. I didn't feel that it was necessary or that it would add to my evaluation. These are methods that I don't typically use in my clinical practice. They are used for various purposes. Different doctors prefer different methods. Psychologists tend to use them a lot. Psychiatrists, I'm a psychiatrist, tend to use other methods more so than these tests. And it was my conclusion that it, particularly with the volume of corroborating information, that is information from police and depositions and so on and so forth, that this type of assessment and evaluation would not add to it.
Okay. As part of your evaluation with John, did you do a mental status examination?
Yes.
What is that?
So a mental status examination is both a formal and informal, a focused and continuous method of observing a person's mental state or state of mind. And since we can't read minds and we can't see into someone's mind directly, it's done by observing them, asking them questions, interacting with them, and making theories about what it is they're thinking about and how their thinking processes are working, and then interacting with them in another way to check those theories. So for example, in a mental status examination, one of the things that I would be looking for, a doctor would be looking for, would be evidence of hallucinations.
I'm going to back up for just a second. Could you describe for the jury the difference between a psychiatrist and a psychologist?
Sure. So a psychiatrist has been to medical school and has received either a DO or an MD, has taken all the same medical courses that any other physician takes, anatomy, physiology, internal medicine, surgery, basics, all of those basic medical courses. And a medical doctor in all 50 states is then required to complete an approved internship in order to obtain a license to practice medicine. So a medical doctor is a trained physician. After that occurs, in my case, after my 1 year of general medical internship, specialty training in psychiatry, which is a 3-year program, is what constitutes the education of a psychiatrist. A psychologist, on the other hand, is a qualified professional who graduates from college and goes to graduate school in psychology and learns about psychological processes. Psychologists often focus a good deal more on research. Some psychologists focus on clinical elements. Psychologists certainly learn a lot about mental illness, and I respect their opinions and ideas. Their training is different, their approach is different. They are grounded in an understanding of the mind from a psychological point of view, and a bit less, I would say, the brain from a medical point of view.
Thank you. Going back to when you're having your evaluation and you're doing this mental status examination, do your years of experience as a physician play into how you observe and interact with a person?
Yes,
And
in a major way. Experience is important. It is especially important in medicine and psychiatry for us to know the limitations of our knowledge. For people with a good deal of experience in medicine to develop a sense of confidence about what they know and can do, and humility about what their limitations are. And it is especially in my experience and my clinical experience that I believe that is an ongoing part of my education, understanding what I can do and what my limitations are.
as part of your evaluation with John, did you sort of make an assessment of his intelligence level?
I did.
And what can you tell the jury about that?
Intelligence is a complicated and sometimes confusing issue. When we talk about intelligence in a formal medical, psychiatric, or psychological sense, usually we're talking about something that comes down to classroom, academic intelligence, intelligence testing intelligence. And in that sense, his fundamental underlying intelligence is in the normal range. However, because of his various brain illnesses and mental health illnesses, his ability to use his intelligence in a reliable way is significantly impaired.
And did you need to do any formal intelligence, or what we hear as IQ testing, in order to make that determination?
I did not. And based on his history, background, experience, his use of vocabulary, his interactions with medical professionals, it's a pretty easy call to say this is a guy who has intelligence in the normal range. We don't need to test it with a specific intelligence test to make sure he's not what we used to call mentally retarded.
Did you have an opportunity to learn of, through records or otherwise, whether John has suffered from a seizure disorder?
Yes, I did. There are reliable reports in his medical records of having suffered from seizures.
Based on your interview with John and your review of all the information that we've talked about, were you able to develop an opinion as to whether John suffers from a mental illness?
Yes.
And what is that opinion?
He certainly does suffer from a mental illness. I would characterize that as a brain illness, and I would make some distinction between a brain illness and a mental illness, but certainly both, if you will.
Okay, and tell us about brain illness versus mental illness.
In order to understand that briefly, it's important to know a little bit about the history of how this comes about. Psychiatry has been a specialty historically that has been focused on behavior and processes of how the brain works that we don't understand and we can't characterize in other medical contexts. So, for example, Parkinson's disease is a disease that causes motor problems and it causes thinking problems. It causes hallucinations. Typically, neurologists rather than psychiatrists treat Parkinson's disease. Typically, we think of that in medicine as a brain disease rather than a mental health problem. It's both. There is not a clear line between mental health problems and brain illness. When a person is stressed out because they're taking an important test in college and they can't sleep and they're anxious and their memory is impaired, we would think of that more as a mental illness. Their brain is basically functioning okay, but under stress, but their mental processes are not functioning so well. And we would think of that more as a mental illness. So in an individual who has rather severe and long-standing dysfunction and has been treated with medication and has seizure disorders and has psychosis, I would consider that that is rooted in the fundamental functioning of the brain. That is a brain illness. There are also aspects of dysfunction in John's life which I would characterize as mental illness. Disruptions in his relationships with people, a lot of anxiety about various factors that aren't directly related to the underlying brain illness.
What would be your diagnosis of what John's brain illness or mental illness is?
So there are a variety of ways of describing that. The most clear and consistent and central diagnosis is that he suffers from a psychotic disorder which is chronic, severe, and progressive. We have a formal characterization which is identified as psychotic disorder, not otherwise specified. That forms a central part of the diagnosis. Other aspects of the diagnosis include a diagnosis of schizophrenia, a diagnosis of schizoaffective disorder, a diagnosis of bipolar disorder with psychotic episodes, and a diagnosis of seizure disorder. Those first three, not the seizure disorder so much, but those first three all overlap. They're often indistinct, especially in complicated cases. They're indistinct. And in this case, they're indistinct. So some experts tend toward the bipolar disorder, some might tend toward the schizophrenic disorder. All of them have the central component of the psychotic condition, the confused thinking, and the dysfunctional life circumstances and lifestyle. So my central diagnosis would be psychotic disorder, and I would say that that overlaps with these other conditions.
So within that umbrella of the psychotic disorder not otherwise specified, is it uncommon to see one doctor say the schizoaffective and another say schizophrenia or bipolar?
No, it's not uncommon at all. And one, in fact, in a complicated case, would expect different experts to come to somewhat different conclusions about the exact diagnosis, because the patient is going to present to people at different times in his life, under different circumstances, with a little different signs, symptoms, and findings. So one would expect that you would see some difference in the diagnosis, but a central overlap in it, which is what occurs here.
Okay. Can a person's more specific diagnosis change over time?
Yes. So in medicine and psychiatry, we certainly strive to reach a clear and definite diagnosis so that we can understand the patient and begin treatment. However, in medicine and psychiatry, all areas, it is critical to understand that the diagnosis may change. It may need to be modified slightly. The details of the diagnosis may change so that we can understand the patient better and provide better treatment. The patient's condition may, in fact, change. They may have a heart problem one day and they don't have the same heart problem 3 weeks later or 2 years later. So the diagnosis doesn't become written in stone and remain constant all the time. Some diagnoses tend to be very consistent. And once it's clear that that's the proper diagnosis, it doesn't change much. But it is important to remain open to changing details in the diagnosis.
Something you just said, some features may remain consistent. Are you familiar with Dr. Arthur, who was Mr. Jonchuck's treating physician at one point?
I am. Dr. Arthur and I were colleagues and worked together some years ago at the university.
Okay. So you know him professionally?
I do.
Okay. And you've had a chance to review his records and relied on them in forming your opinion about Mr. Jonchuck?
That is correct, yes.
And was Dr. Arthur treating Mr. Jonchuck for a serious mental illness?
He was. I believe his primary diagnosis was bipolar disorder. He was also treating him with antipsychotic medications. I believe that was a part of his diagnosis and case formulation.
There was something else you said that I wanted to pick up on. As a person goes into treatment and maybe their symptoms are changing or the illness is changing, do you as a treating physician at time, do you need to change medications that you're prescribing in order to adjust to those changes?
Yes. Fortunately and unfortunately, medication changes, especially in brain illness and mental illness and psychiatry, are frequently needed and an area of grave concern and often significant problems because a person's lifestyle changes, because other medications they take change, because their physiological condition changes. A medication which might be really good at one time is not so good at another time. A medication that the patient and the doctor might both think is good at one time, they may discover later on is not so good for some other reasons. So medication monitoring and medication changes are a critical part of all medicine, I would say, especially when dealing with the brain.
You've talked about psychosis now, and that you believe John was suffering from is suffering from a psychotic disorder. I'd like to talk about psychosis and psychotic disorder a little bit and sort of break it down. To start with, what is the phrase having a psychotic break? What does that mean?
So it's a phrase that's used in medicine and in common language, and it refers to the idea that psychosis is a condition where there is a break from common sense reality. Psychosis by itself is a symptom, not a disease. So fever is a symptom, not a disease. Fever might mean you have pneumonia, it might mean you have the flu, it might mean something else. Psychosis, just in isolation, is a symptom. So a psychotic break may be a symptom. It might be a symptom of an underlying psychotic disorder, or it might be a symptom of something else. But it's used to describe a break from reality.
Is having psychosis simply hallucinations and delusions?
No, it's not, and it's a complex process, and it is sometimes understood and even misunderstood by medical professionals as hallucinations or delusions. So someone might say, well, psychosis is having hallucinations or delusions. And I wouldn't say that that's wrong, but it's very incomplete.
What's the rest of it?
So the rest of it is that an individual who is psychotic is out of touch with reality in some important respect. They may be having hallucinations, and it's important to be aware that hallucinations can be related to sound, they can be related to vision, they can be related to touch, They can be related to internal sensations. Hallucinations are false perceptions that seem to be real perceptions. So if a person is having auditory hallucinations or sound hallucinations, they will often say, and in the medical world we use the term voices, they will often say, I'm hearing voices. Doctors will ask their patients, are you hearing voices? And if they're having auditory hallucinations and psychotic, they will usually, not always reveal that they are, usually say, well, yeah, I am. And those voices will be a clear, usually short phrase that the patient relates to, and it feels like it's a real external voice and it's powerful. So that's what a hallucination is. A visual hallucination, same thing. A touch hallucination, same thing. Touch hallucinations or tactile hallucinations are very disturbing to patients because it's very hard to know if they think they felt something on their arm and they look and there's nothing there, that there wasn't really something there when they felt it. So different hallucinations can involve different senses. So all of this is a part of psychosis. To go to the next step, delusions. Delusions are false beliefs that are strongly held, that are contrary to reality, common sense reality, and they're not things that are religious or cultural. So you can't say, well, he believes this particular religious thing, and that doesn't make any sense to me, so that's a delusion. That is not a delusion. That's a religious idea that a person might hold firmly, somebody else might not agree with. It's not a delusion. A delusion is the idea that the CIA is looking at me through that clock up there. In common language, a crazy idea about something that's happening in the world that really can't possibly be happening. Sometimes delusions and realistic beliefs can merge together, and sometimes it's not always clear to the doctor that a person is having a delusion. A common delusion is that people are after me, people don't like me, people are spying on me. Well, maybe this is a guy who's not such a nice neighbor. Maybe he does things that his neighbors don't like. Maybe his neighbors really don't like him. Maybe they do keep an eye out for him and watch him at times. Maybe that's a delusion, maybe it isn't. Sometimes delusions are hard to distinguish from exaggerated beliefs. For it to be a delusion, it has to be clearly disconnected with common sense reality. In addition to hallucinations and delusions, there are other aspects of psychosis that are related to confusion and, again, contrary to common sense reality. And we sometimes group them together as thought disorder, a disorder of thinking. So a disorder of thinking would include the idea that a person can be in two places at the same time, simultaneously, and there's no conflict with that. That's not logical. It's not a hallucination. It's not a delusion. It's a thought disorder, and it's a symptom of psychosis. So that is a symptom of psychosis. Other thought disorders would be that a person can be dead and alive at the same time. Other thought disorders would be the idea that a person could die and come back to life, not as a religious belief, but as a break from reality. So thought disorders are confused, illogical ideas. They often combine with what we might think of as normal everyday confusion in a very exaggerated sense. So a person might say, well, it seems like I won the lottery, but I didn't have any money in my bank account, so I don't understand what's going on. So a person who is suffering from a thought disorder will often, if you really can get them to talk about what they're thinking, acknowledge that they're very confused about what's real and what isn't real. A fourth important aspect of psychosis is the emotional aspect. People who are psychotic are almost always, not inevitably, almost always distressed, anxious, unhappy, desperate, miserable. Very often they're overwhelmed with fear and anxiety. So the emotional component of psychosis is another critical aspect of it. When a person has all four of these components, hallucinations, delusions, thought disorder, and the emotional component, each of those makes the other one worse. As one can well imagine, if you're seeing things that aren't really there and believing that somebody's trying to kill you and confused and fearful and anxious, all of those things combine together to create an individual who is incapable of realistically appreciating and dealing with common sense reality. So that's a more complete description of psychosis than the simple description that it is hallucinations and delusions.
When you talked about the thought disorder aspect of psychosis, can being in a psychotic state and experiencing this thought problem, can it affect a person's ability to encode memories?
Yes. First, memories are disturbed because the person's experience is disturbed, is disconnected from reality. But in addition to that, a person's ability to understand what really does happen in their environment is distorted as they make an effort to think, okay, what just happened? And then they say to themselves, okay, this is what happened. So the hallucination might distort that, the delusion might distort that, and the thought disorder might distort that. So all of those things distort a person's ability to create accurate memories, which then they can recall later. You used the word encode memories. That's what I understand her meaning to be. That what she's asking about is our ability to create the memory so that we can recall that memory later.
And if a person is in a state wherein they're having a hard time creating the memories, can that affect that person's ability to later talk about what happened in a way that makes sense, or as to what really happened?
Yes, and essentially all people, whether they're suffering from brain illness, mental illness, or nothing at all, want to feel and believe that they can remember their past and think about it logically and rationally with some reasonable level of accuracy and reliability. So one of the things we all do is we try to figure out, well, what really happened in the parking lot there when that guy stole my parking space? Did he really steal it, or was he there first? And we encode memories about that. And our feelings about that in a normal way affect us. In mental illness and brain illness circumstances, our ability to encode and remember those things is distorted.
Does a psychotic episode stay constant? Is the person always acting in the same way when they're having this experience?
No. Psychotic illnesses almost always have periods where they are less problematic and other periods where they're more problematic. Many psychotic illnesses, John's psychotic illness, are chronic. They exist with a baseline level all the time. The psychosis never completely goes away. Medications can help, other interventions can help. Persons with chronic psychotic illnesses, there's always what I would describe as a baseline level of some of these psychotic symptoms. Almost always, individuals with psychotic illness also have periods where, for some period of time, the psychotic symptoms are much worse, much more intense, much more problematic. That might be related to stress in their environment, it might be related to medication changes, it might be related to some other factor. And we medically refer to these as psychotic episodes. So what is typical of a psychotic illness is that there will be a baseline level and there will be much more intense psychotic episodes on top of that.
Is another aspect of psychosis something called ideas of reference?
Yes.
And what is that?
So ideas of reference refer to the situation where a person who is not thinking clearly, a person who is psychotic or suffering from psychotic symptoms, gets the idea in their head that something that is in fact really happening in the external environment, a TV program or a statement by a relative or something they've seen somewhere, has very special, unique, specific meaning to them and their circumstances. So an idea of reference might be that you see something on television that's just a regular, normal TV ad, and you begin to believe that it's especially related to you, that it's been designed and directed to you, and it might be important that you take some action based on that idea of reference. So the idea is that you get an idea in your head that you think refers specifically to you in a powerful way.
Ms. McNeil, it's time for a break whenever, you know.
This would be a great point.
Okay. We'll take our morning recess until 10:55. Hands on the chairs. Thank you.
Jurors are out of the hearing, go on.
Any issues to be addressed?